Radio Network.
Michael Moore's film, Capitalism, is already online. I haven't seen it, but I've talked to Jason Burmis. Someone made a copy and showed him. And Michael Moore exposes an internal Citibank document in the film that isn't even out yet that talks about how they're destroying the economy by design. We have the head climatologist at NASA writing a book saying they want to destroy the industrial economy to save the environment. We have Bill Gates talking about this. We have Maurice Strong at the UN. I'm going to talk about that in the next hour. But joining us for the next 51 minutes, the author of How the Economy Was Lost, The War of the Worlds, Paul Craig Roberts. And he joins us via video connection from his home. And this book is just now hitting store shelves, or here in the near future we'll get the actual details from Dr. Roberts. I just got this in the mail Friday, just had a chance to scan over it today. Excellent book from this multi-time best-selling author. Of course, he was an editor at Wall Street Journal, the father of Reaganomics, head of policy under Ronald Reagan at the Department of Treasury, and he's a real conservative who's spoken out against the neocons and this whole system, and it's great to have him joining us. Sir, thanks for coming on.
Pleased to be with you, Alex.
Well, so much is happening, and before I start throwing out questions, what is most important on your radar today, sir?
Well, the book.
Well, let's talk about the book.
Well, that's a good idea, Alex, because what I'm able to do in this book, in just common sense terms, it's easy to read, very short chapters, is to explain to people how their economic future has been destroyed. There are many villains, but the biggest one is the offshoring of the jobs. Because when you offshore the jobs, you offshore the incomes. And when you offshore the incomes, you offshore the gross domestic product. And so what offshoring does is it makes us poorer. It's a process of becoming less developed. And it destroys career opportunities. It destroys the ladders of upward mobility. And it makes recovery from recessions impossible because there's nothing left to recover.
Well, sir, you're not a sick person. You tried to cut taxes for America, one of the biggest growth rates we ever had in the last century, if I'm correct, the second fastest growth rate in the 20th century. Correct me if I'm wrong, because you want people to do well. You want to empower the free market. And so talking to you in the past, it seems you have somewhat of a blind spot, or correct me if I'm wrong, towards believing that the system would want to destroy and consolidate power to create monopolies. But I have all the globalist own statements that this is what they want. But regardless, this is the end scenario. This is what globalization and offshoring has delivered to us, is deindustrialization, lowering standard of livings across the West.
That's exactly correct. Whether it's an intentional plan or whether it's the result of incompetence and incentives and greed, it doesn't much matter because the effect on the people is the same. And until they have a grasp of it, they can't react no matter what the cause is.
Well, let's specifically talk about the disease and what's happened with NAFTA and GATT and the rest of it versus the cure, because you covered the disease and the cure in your book.
Well, as I said, Alex, and as you know, there are many adverse happenings. And the book mentions a number of them, but its main focus is on the offshoring of the jobs. And this came about largely, in my view, because of the incentive structure. Wall Street pressured corporations to increase the shareholder return, that is, to be more profitable, produce more capital gains. The government passed a law that a company could not deduct executive pay in excess of $1 million as a business expense, unless it was performance related. And an earlier reform, which requires quarterly reporting, the unintended result of that was to focus companies and the top executives on very short-run profits. So you had that kind of incentive system. Now, what kept it from going wrong for a long time was it wasn't really possible to offshore the jobs because there was no high-speed internet, and so you couldn't have intellectual work, skilled professional work like engineering done offshore and sent in. And the world was still socialist. You couldn't open factories in communist China and hire their labor, for example. And so the collapse of world socialism, the rise of the high-speed internet, created a totally new economic environment in which the incentives that already existed, the cap on executive pay, the pressure from Wall Street on the firms, the result was that firms started closing plant and equipment in the United States, or if they built new plant and equipment, build it abroad, and they greatly increased the profits and their own remuneration by substituting very cheap foreign labor for American labor. And this has now gone on long enough that many American firms that we once knew as manufacturing firms, they're really just marketing firms selling an American brand name that's made offshore. And so by moving all these jobs and facilities offshore, they have reduced the opportunities for Americans, increased them from foreigners, and when the goods come back in, they count as imports and are responsible for a good percentage of our very large trade deficit, which in turn has to be financed by giving over the ownership of the existing American assets, existing companies, real estate, even toll roads. Foreigners now even own 99-year leases on toll roads in Virginia and Illinois and in other states. And so when they then end up as owners of the tolls, the capital gains, the dividends, the rents, the interest that were formerly going into American coffers, they now go abroad too. So this worsens the current account deficit, which is the next step up from the trade deficit. So it's put the United States in a situation where it is now a massive debtor. It has massive debts to service, and yet it has massive deficits, both domestic budget deficits and trade deficits that make it increasingly impossible to service. So that is a dilemma. How do you bring an economy back that's in that situation?
Well, how do you do that?
Well, to the extent that it could be done, I think there are two things that you have to do. First, you have to protect the dollar's reserve currency role, because if we lose that, we can't pay for our import bill. We simply can't pay for the imports. So they would have to do something to bring the jobs back. Now, historically, you could have relied on high tariffs on goods made offshore, but we now have so many trade agreements that we would have to wiggle out of that might not be possible. But what you could do is change the way you tax corporations. Instead of having an income tax, you could tax them according to where the value is added to their product. In other words, if their worldwide production, if the value is added mainly in the United States, then they would have a low tax rate. But if it was added abroad, China, for example, they would have a high tax rate. And so you could use taxation then to offset the advantage of the very low-cost foreign labor. If you did that, you would then be showing the world, hey, look, they're going to get the trade deficit under control. They're going to, again, have an economy that makes things and creates high-paid jobs and restores a middle class. So that would be one thing that could be done, at least conceptually. Now, of course, the large global corporations would fight it, and they don't want that. They want the profits that they get from the cheap foreign labor. So whether or not the government or the people could prevail over these powerful moneyed interests, we would have to doubt very much. But conceptually, that would be something that could be done.